Today's guest is Jake Eagle, who helps people live their life to their full potential. Listen in to learn how to live a thrilling life today. Welcome to Richer Soul, Life Beyond Money, the last baby step. Imagine it's 12 months from now. You've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? What's it like to have great relationships, friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money? To be able to make the choices you want, to be fearless and open to trying new adventures. Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time. Your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. I help people live the life of their dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. You can learn how by listening to the framework in episodes 1 through 9. It's simpler than you can imagine. You can also hear actual coaching calls by looking under the coaching call tab on richersoul.com. You'll also find all the show notes for this episode there, and there's a link in this episode. I send out a monthly email, and you can sign up while you're there. In the monthly email, I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. I also share the most interesting articles I read on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. Today, we're going to focus on living a thrilling life. Gratitude is the key to living an abundant life. And when we trade our expectations for gratitude, life becomes thrilling. If you heard the episode with my daughter, it was actually recorded after this one, but it was sequenced ahead of it. Jake Eagle has been a licensed psychotherapist in private practice for 25 years. He is also an award-winning author and retreat leader. In the 1990s, he was one of the first people to introduce neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, to audiences in Japan. Early in his career, he focused on brief therapy, but over time, his emphasis has shifted, and now he coaches people interested in resolving existential issues, finding meaning and purpose in their lives, and reducing anxiety associated with feeling alone and living with uncertainty. Jake is a game changer and expert in conscious reassignment, developing a healthy ego, relationships and dating, and authenticity. Let's meet him. Welcome to Richer Soul, Jake. It's great to have you join us today.
It's good to be here, Rocky. I've been looking forward to this.
As have I. This is going to be a wonderful conversation today, and I think our listeners are really going to enjoy it. As always, we like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
I grew up in New England, and from the time I was born until my father retired, he always had his own business. He had a company in Boston. He had 60 employees. They were mostly immigrants, people who came over and had particular trade skills, which had to do with the line of reupholstering furniture. And as those people aged, I saw my father go through a process of downsizing his business and dealing with a lot of changes, and then closing the business, taking great pride in the fact that he got a job for everyone that still worked for him when he closed it. Then we moved and he started other businesses. So business and money was part of our dinner time conversation. It was completely part of my life growing up. There was nothing about it that seemed unfamiliar or intimidating.
And that's quite different than most people. I think you had a unique perspective with that.
Yeah, and it resulted when I was 16, I left home, moved away, and started my first business, which was a small business painting houses. I hired guys that were in high school with me. I borrowed my mom's car, bought 3 ladders, and for 4 years, I had a business while I continued completing my education part-time. And again, I didn't even think about it. I didn't hesitate. I read an article in Newsweek about a guy who had done something very similar, and I said, boy, that sounds great. And so I went ahead and started my first business, and then 4 years later, I sold that company to the guy who was my foreman. I then started another company, which was a health club for women. It was a franchise. And over the next 15 years, I actually went through this process 6 times where I started businesses and sold them. They were all small companies, businesses with anywhere from 5 to 12 employees.
That's pretty incredible. If kids started businesses at 16 and launched themselves, we wouldn't have to deal with the college struggle and figuring out how to pay for all these things and so forth. That's pretty impressive. Are there certain lessons you learned from running businesses with regards to money and how to manage it within the business?
Yeah, I think that what I learned was about being very pragmatic. I had to make payroll every 2 weeks. I had to hustle. I had to really pay attention to being responsible to the people who worked for me. I just grew up with a very healthy sense of responsibility, holding people accountable, expecting people to hold me accountable. It was all on a small scale, but the lessons were great, and later in life they served me very well. I'm kind of jumping ahead, and maybe we'll go there later, but eventually I went back to school and I became a psychotherapist. And as a therapist, my approach was also very pragmatic. It was very focused on helping people think about their life goals, look at their finances, think about where they wanted to go, how are they going to get there, do they have a financial plan? Many of the people that came to me were people who owned their own businesses because I spoke their language. But regardless of that, I was always very focused on the basics. And I think that comes from my earliest training or education, having owned my own companies.
Were your parents somewhat intentional in teaching you these skills, or did you just kind of naturally gather it from the dinner time conversation?
Yeah, it was all natural. It was just listening to my dad talk about his day at the office. In the summertime, I would go to work with him, and I'd do various things in the office, paperwork, filing. I would occasionally sit in when he was running meetings. And I just had a sense of what it meant to have a business and have responsibilities. Just to me, it was just completely natural.
I don't know if you call it a joke, but it's these 2 little fish are swimming, and the big fish comes by and says, "How's the water?" And the 2 little fish look at each other and go, "What's water?"
Yeah, right.
And the sense is, when you grow up in that culture, it just becomes natural to you. It's just the way you think and the way you believe and the way it works out. You also have kids. What have you done to teach your kids, and how has that worked out?
Well, it hasn't worked out all that well. I married my wife, Hannah, when her daughters were 14 and 16. So I didn't have a lot of influence on them in the early years. They were both, I would say, completely unaware of money, completely unaware of business. And I've now been their stepdad for 25 years. And they've grown up and they're young women and they both make a living, but they're very typical. Many of the people that I worked with as a therapist, what I mean by that is they're in their 40s. One of them has a son, my grandson, and they've done no planning for their financial future. Neither one of them have a retirement account. The oldest one actually contacted me yesterday and asked for some advice on setting up her first IRA, but she's 46 years old. And I see this a lot. I have clients in their 40s, in their 50s, even in their 60s, who have done no preparation for retiring. And I actually think it could potentially be a real crisis for our culture.
Wow. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, I'm just interested in why, after running all these businesses, you decided to go back to school and learn this and kind of change what you were doing.
Well, what I realized when I was running companies is that I was fascinated with leadership. And so I focused a lot on my own leadership, and I went to leadership seminars and trainings. And I became fascinated with a field. At the time, it was called organizational development. And it's basically the idea of how do you go in and work with the human dynamics of an organization to make that organization more effective. And it really captivated me. So I just realized that leadership was something I was really fascinated and passionate about learning more about. And what I realized is that I wanted to help individuals fulfill their potential more than I wanted to focus on making money or how productive we were as a company. So I went back to school. I got licensed as a psychotherapist, started a practice, and I did attract a lot of people who were in business, but my focus was less on their business and more on their own personal development. How do you conduct yourself to be an effective leader? How do you conduct yourself so that you feel good about yourself as a person, which I actually believe contributes to being an effective leader. So that's how I made that transition. And that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years.
And it's kind of not in a sense of follow your passions, but the areas that interest you and you can serve. And when you can find that intersection, it creates abundance of opportunities. So why do you think all these people struggling with money and savings and doing these things? Because at their basics, they're very simple. I mean, all of this stuff is really simple, and yet I find it's very hard for people to do it.
Yeah, I think that we lost our way. My parents were from the Great Generation. Dad fought in World War II and had a basic set of values. There was a sense that we had enough, but also that we should be, I don't know if the word is frugal, but very thoughtful about how we spent our money, about what we did, about what we purchased. There was a kind of a conservative quality. And yet I never felt a lack. I never felt like there's anything I wanted that I didn't have. I remember when I bought my first car, my parents said, if you want to buy a car, save enough money. Save $300. I bought a used Volkswagen. I was driving it home and the engine blew. And it was $300 to fix the engine. And my parents said, well, we'll split it with you. You earn half the money, we'll give you the other half. So there were these very basic lessons. Now, when Hannah and I were married and we were raising the girls, they had expectations that they would graduate high school and get a car. In fact, we didn't do that, but they had expectations. And to me, there was a sense of entitlement that I did not grow up with. I'm 62 years old now. My daughters in their 40s had a very different expectation about the world than the expectations that I had.
I've been intentional in raising my kids, and from a very young age, we were clear to them, if you want a car, you're going to have to figure out how to save money to buy it. If you want to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to pay for these types of things. And so we've been intentional with that.
How has that worked out? How old are the kids?
So the kids are 15 and 17. My daughter saved up a bunch of money towards buying a car. And there were a couple things that happened. One was I made her watch Dave Ramsey's financial stuff for high school. And in the midst of that, Dave Ramsey talked about how he paid for half the kids' cars. So the kids halfway through the program go, you're making us watch his program. You got to do what Dave says, and you got to pay for half the car. I said, okay, I'll deal with that. So we did pay for half the car, and we probably paid for more than half the car because we wanted certain safety features, and we're in a little bit more rural area and a lot of highway driving. And so we just wanted a little bit more metal around her. And so we were comfortable making up that difference. She's now going to college this fall. College is turning out to be a lot more expensive than expected. We were told certain things as we started applying to these schools, and we're starting to find out that it isn't what we expected money-wise. But she's making a good, conscious decision. She understands she's got to earn money and pay for it. Unfortunately, the college market is unreasonable these days unless you kind of take a non-traditional path. And as we're sitting here at kind of the end of the journey, looking backwards, we realize we should have done something different. And so now for my son, who's 2 years behind, we're taking a dramatic left turn and saying, you're going to do this differently because the way we did it here didn't work out. which is to kind of build up all the college credits ahead of time while you're still in high school. But they do understand that things cost money and that they have to make choices and that it's not an expectation attitude. We're probably a little bit too giving, though, but in between.
Listening to you reminds me, I hadn't thought about it until just now, but there were 3 kids in my family, older brother, older sister. I was the youngest. My parents put my brother through college. They bought him a brand new car when he was in college. They bought my sister a car, and they put her through college, but she only went for 2 years. By the time I was ready to go to college, things had shifted, and they weren't doing as well. My dad was struggling with a new business he had just started. They didn't put me through college. I paid my own way. They didn't give me a car. They only paid for half of the repair of the engine. And if you looked at the 3 kids, I know this sounds funny, but if you looked at the 3 kids, I turned out, I don't want to say the best, but I turned out knowing how to take care of myself better than my siblings. And I just had to learn from an early age. I had to learn to take care of myself. Now, my parents were incredibly supportive and loving and encouraging, but they didn't give me a lot, not from a financial, material point of view. It served me really well.
So there's a book out there, and it's more about charity, and it says When Giving Hurts, meaning that sometimes we give to charity, and what we do in the name of charity causes more problems than it solves. And I think it's the same kind of lesson that your parents saw, or that we've kind of seen here, is when you give kids too much and you create that entitlement attitude, even though you're trying to help your kids, you're hurting them.
Yeah, I agree.
You're not building resilience. And so you don't need to give them all this stuff. And there's balance there. You still need to give them love and support and emotional filling up their tank, which costs nothing. I mean, a hug costs nothing but time.
Right, absolutely.
That is probably far more important than the car and the stuff. And I think as I look back now, I'm seeing that very much so. And so I'm glad we really haven't given the kids, they've had a wonderful life, better than most, but we don't just hand them things.
Yeah.
So you started coaching these business owners and helping them to be leaders. Were you finding money trouble with them as well?
I had a very interesting lesson early on. I was coaching business owners, and mostly they were small companies. The only one that your audience would be familiar with was Ben & Jerry's. They were a client of mine when they were a small company in Vermont, which is where I went to school. And what I learned early on is that most of the people who wanted and needed my services were businesses that were struggling. They were having problems. They would hire me to help them, but they had limited resources to work with. And so after about a year or two of doing coaching and consulting, I realized that there were very successful people who also needed help. The difference is that they had resources. So when I went in and worked with those people, and Ben & Jerry's was an example, they were a small company, but they were making a lot of money. When I went in and worked with them, they were able to execute. They were able to implement. They were able to take a good idea and run with it. So it made my job, easier and much more rewarding. And so what I ended up doing was focusing on fast growth companies that were having the problems associated with success. And I actually don't remember the year right now. I think it was in the mid-'80s. I ended up taking a year off, traveled around the United States, and I wrote a book after I studied 25 companies that were on the Inc. 500. I went around and I spent time with the owner of each of those businesses trying to understand what it was that made them uniquely successful. It was a great year, and it was a fascinating experience. I wrote the book and wasn't actually able to get it published. I had one publisher that was interested, but they wanted to change the name, and I wasn't happy with it. So it's been sitting on my shelf all this time. But I learned a lot.
So what were the keys to success?
They were interesting in that the most significant takeaway for me was that the people who were successful generally were successful pretty quickly. They had an idea. They took it out into the world. They didn't necessarily perfect it. They just took it out. And the world either responded or it didn't. And when it did, then the business owner would adapt and adjust and ride the wave. Where the people who were less successful were people who didn't do well in the beginning, they were struggling, and they fought, and they kept fighting, and they did not have the same level of success. The other thing that was interesting to me is that I identified two kinds of businesses. One was a vision-driven business where the owner had an idea, and he or she would implement that idea. And they were more successful than the companies, and I called them market-driven companies, where the owner would say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to see what the marketplace wants. And when I figure out what the marketplace wants or needs, I'm going to find a way to fill that need. They were less successful. Now, some of this is counterintuitive because, as you know, today in business, a lot of the advice we get is listen to our customers, right? Let them kind of tell us what they need. But 35 years ago, and I'm not sure that it would be different today, I don't know, it was people who had a vision, acted on it quickly, listened to people and adapted, that were doing really well.
As I look at business today, there's current terms for a lot of these things. One is a minimal viable product. So what is the minimal viable product that I can offer without being perfect, as you say? Because we look for perfection, we're sitting there for years and we don't even know if anyone's going to buy it. So come out with something small, get feedback from the market, make changes, and continue to improve it. And this way you're not investing a significant amount of time or money. And if something hits, then that's when you put your time and money into continually improving it. And as far as the vision, I mean, that literally is what I think of when I think of Steve Jobs and Apple. There was a guy who said, I have a vision. He didn't go out to the market and say, do you want a phone that takes pictures and can do email and can be your calendar and be video and the internet? He didn't do any of that.
That's right.
He said, I have a vision. Here it is. And he did the same thing with the iPod. And so clearly, if you've got a great vision, then it works. And sometimes your vision is out of sync with where the world is today. So you might be ahead of the curve. And sometimes it's a timing thing too.
I also think it's changed a lot. I often talk with my wife about the fact that I think it was much easier to be in business 30 years ago, 20 years ago, before the internet. And that may surprise your listeners because the barrier to entry today is very low. All you need is a website. You're up and running. But the problem is there's so much competition today. When I was young and I started the various businesses that I started, there wasn't nearly as much competition. I was able to distinguish myself from the few competitors I had, and it was local. And so I was able to have a significant influence because my business resided in my community. Where today, I mean, I still have a business. My wife and I put on retreats, and we do that a few times a year, and we market them through the internet. But a great number of people who read what we write and listen to our webinars and things, they don't know us. We've never met them. We don't have the same level of connection that I used to have when my businesses were local in the community. So I think it's gotten more complicated. Even though in some ways it looks easy, I think it's more difficult to start a business today.
I think it depends on what kind of business, because if you're going to start a painting company today and go out and show up and actually paint and do the work and charge a fair and reasonable price, you'll be full in no time.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. And that doesn't depend on the internet at all, does it?
No, it doesn't. It depends on you putting up signs and flyers and showing up and doing the work.
Right.
I think that's what a lot of people don't do is show up and do the work.
I'm laughing because right now we're in Hawaii, which is where we moved a year ago, and we're building a house. And it has been, the challenge has been to get people to show up and do the work.
See that? It'd be very easy to start a company out there and say, hey, we show up and do the work. How about that?
Yeah.
So I have rentals and I flip houses. And right now, across the board, what we're hearing from everyone is not only can we not find properties, we can't find workers when we get a property to go in and do the work. Our last two properties has been very difficult to get workers to show up to do the remodels. It's just hot market. And if there were people out there ready and willing, the work is there if you want to do it. You just have to go where it's hot and be willing to do it.
Right.
One of the things that I always like to talk about, though, is understanding your purpose in life, what it is that you want to do. And I think you've got some words of wisdom to share in that area.
Well, my purpose has been very singular since I was rather young. I have just been completely fascinated in helping people fulfill their potential. When I was 18 and I was running my painting company, I also started another business on the side, which was called Potentially Yours. And the idea is I would put ads in the paper and I would ask people to write letters, and then I would write back, and I would always sign it Potentially Yours. And it was all about helping people figure out and tap into their potential. It's just been a fascination I've had my whole life. I have a sense that we don't come anywhere close to tapping our potential. And I mean that in many ways. It's not just about money and success. It's also in our relationships. It's as parents. It's as children helping our parents when they're older. I think there's so much more that we can do than what we do, but we're distracted. We distract ourselves largely with material things and superficial things and being busy all the time. But this passion about figuring out how to fulfill our potential has always been my driving question.
So what have you learned, and what prevents people from achieving their potential?
Well, it goes back to the joke that you shared earlier about the fish. Essentially, I think we go through our lives largely unconscious. I think that we, for the most part, are operating on autopilot. We get into routines, we form habits, and we just get busy and keep going. And so my work and the work I do with my wife is about helping people wake up and live more consciously. That's actually the name of the work. It's called Live Conscious, liveconscious.com. The idea is to wake up and make conscious choices about how you want to treat your partner, how you want to raise your kids, what kind of diet you want to be on. It isn't that there's a right answer for everybody. It's for each one of us to take the time to step back and really think, what is right for me at this point in my life? And when we're more conscious about the decisions we make, I think we're much more likely to be effective in terms of executing, in terms of accomplishing what we want.
So how is it we have so many people who are living unconsciously? Like, is it just societal pressure? Is it the fact that every 2 seconds you see an ad, and in between the two you see another?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to pinpoint it, I would say money, materialism has really distracted us from things that at the end of our lives, we look back and we realize, gee, love, connection, community, those are the things that really mattered. Now, I'm not suggesting that people don't have or shouldn't have a nice home and a safe car and basic things that give them pleasure. But I think the focus we put on that side of the scale is excessive. I do a simple practice, Rocky. I get up every morning and I read anywhere from 1 to 3 pages. It's not a lot, but it's 1 to 3 pages of somebody who was extremely thoughtful. And it just sets my mind in a direction for the day. It gets me thinking at a deeper level instead of getting up and watching the news or getting up and looking at Facebook, which I actually never do. But I want to have a conversation every morning, first thing, with somebody who's really thoughtful.
Can you give me an example of a person who's thoughtful?
Oh, I'll read Thomas Merton. Typically, he just has these beautiful, interesting ideas that make me think, and they wake my mind up. And that's really what I need. But it isn't always somebody that's heavy. The other day, I woke up and I was reading, you remember The Velveteen Rabbit?
Yes.
Yeah. So The Velveteen Rabbit, there's a degree to which it's really thoughtful. Can I read you a paragraph?
Absolutely.
It's on my computer because I was so impressed I wrote this down. So it says, you become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or who have sharp edges or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. I read that, and I just had a moment of self-reflection about myself, about Hannah, the fact that we're aging, the fact that we are, most of my hair has been loved off. And I then shared it with people in our community. I sent an email to people in our community, and it started a conversation that was a thoughtful conversation. To me, that's an example of how I want to start every day. And as I say, it doesn't have to be heavy or deep, but it's stimulating something in me that is valuable to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is most enjoyable. And I kind of do the same thing. I start the day more so reading religious material, and usually sometime in the morning I also read a little bit of Stoicism because it helps me to break free of materialism and reflect back. And I'm just amazed at some of the quotes going back 2,000 years, how little people have changed and how much we're still the same, even though we've seen dramatic changes in the world itself.
Yeah, and the Stoics really got to the crux of the matter very quickly. Are you familiar with any of the writings of Thomas Merton?
I am not familiar with him. No, I will have to look those up.
He was a monk, philosopher, beautiful writer. A very short passage that he wrote goes as follows. It says, "The more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer, because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. The one who does most to avoid suffering is in the end the one who suffers most."
And that does not surprise me. And I think it's like the same way with happiness. When you're looking for happiness, you're not going to be happy. You just kind of need to be happy on the inside to begin with. And it's along the similar lines. You can't avoid the suffering. And in the moment of suffering, you still need to be happy, and you still need to be in a state of gratitude.
Well, exactly. And that's the word. That word gratitude is central. And there's something that you said. How is it that we don't feel rich and thrilled in our lives? Do you remember that?
I've done a lot of episodes.
All right. Well,
but basically,
me.
In the sense that we're living in the United States of America. If you're listening to this podcast, in all essence, you're living in the top 1% of the world. You have more niceties and more great things than a king could have 100 years ago. And so we literally have abundance in the world that we live in today, if you're listening to this. And yet, we struggle.
Right, absolutely agree. And what really sparked my interest, and the reason I remembered that, is because you used the word thrilled. And I started this project 5 months ago. We had moved to Hawaii. We had a really nice life in Santa Fe. Everything was quite beautiful. We had a nice home. We both had very successful private practices, but there was something missing. So we came to Hawaii for a month. This is a couple years ago. We came to Hawaii for a month, and we just felt younger and more alive and more excited. And we decided, you know what? Let's go home, put our house on the market, and move here. It was actually very naive in hindsight. There's a lot of things we didn't think about. So we're in Hawaii. I'm 62. Hannah's in her late 60s. All of a sudden, we know no one. We have no clients. We actually have very little income. And we were shocked. We were really shocked. And it's now been 11 months, and we've kind of worked our way through this. But the first few months are really challenging. And so I woke up one morning, and here I am, right? I'm in Hawaii, married to the woman of my dreams. I have a great life. We're going to build a house. And I wasn't happy. And I asked myself, am I thrilled to be alive? Because I should be. And in that moment, something in me woke up. Am I thrilled to be alive? So I start thinking about this all the time, all day long. I'm thinking, am I thrilled to be alive? And I start to realize all the things I have in my life that are amazing. I'm relatively healthy. I'm living in this amazing place with this amazing woman, doing work, maybe not as much as I wanted at the time, but doing work that I love, with ideas about how to do more. So I started asking other people. I started saying to people, are you thrilled to be alive? Well, I've documented this. So I've asked over 300 people, are you thrilled to be alive? And guess how many people said yes?
9.
None. Everybody said things like, and these are vibrant, healthy people. Everybody said things like, well, I'm really pleased, or I'm very satisfied, or I feel grateful, or I have a good life. But nobody just was celebrating. Nobody said, I'm thrilled to be alive. So I decided to start a course. And I created a 21-day program. The reason I did this is because I have a colleague, and I asked him, are you thrilled to be alive? And he said, well, I never thought about it. He said, I should be, but I guess I'm not. So we both said, let's do this 21-day program where every day we write to each other about whether we're thrilled to be alive. And if not, why not? And we know each other pretty well. So my job was to remind him every day that he has an amazing life. His job every day was to remind me that I have an amazing life. That's what we did. Well, at the end of 21 days, the two of us felt more gratitude, more awe, more excitement than either one of us had experienced in our adult lives. So we stopped the program, the 21 days, and we kind of slowly started to fall back. And 3 weeks later, I called him up and I said, hey, you want to do it again? And so we did. Now, what's interesting is the second time through was sort of less of a thrill, but the experience of being thrilled went deeper. And he and I both now feel like we kind of have this in our bones, that we wake up in a different place than we woke up 4 months ago. And so I've actually been teaching this online with groups of 10 people at a time. We do a class once a week. They buddy up, and their job is to basically reflect back to their buddy. Hey, you know what? You may be having a problem today, but you have an amazing life. Don't forget. And the analogy I use is you're painting a painting on a very large canvas. It's a beautiful painting. It's your life. It's the people who you love. It's the people who love you. It's the accomplishments you've made. It's the health you have, the ability to make choices. Somewhere on that painting, there's something that's a little bit off. It's dirty or ugly. And people focus on that. And it's just a tiny little thing in this painting. Anyway, the word thrilled was very eye-opening for me. It's a high contrast word. It's not a word people use often. And I've been using it extensively for the last 4 months and seeing remarkable results when people really start asking this question, am I thrilled to be alive?
So usually at the end of the show, I ask people for an action step. And I think I'm going to do something different. We're going to call it right here in the middle. This show gets posted to Facebook on the Facebook page for Richer Soul. When this goes live, I'm going to ask the question, are you thrilled to be alive? And share. Let's see how many of you want to just start posting about what it is that thrills you in life. And
yeah,
I will start the conversation and get it going, and we'll see what happens. So that'll be cool.
That's great. And depending on where it goes, if people want to explore it more deeply, let people know about the work we're doing, because I actually haven't even been charging for these courses. It's been a beta project. I've been doing it as a research project. I'm fascinated by this conversation that you and I are having, because I agree with you. We are in the top, 1%, let's just say. And primarily, and it's not just because I'm a therapist, primarily people are going around finding things to be unhappy about, finding reasons to say, poor me. And a lot of this, by the way, therapy contributes to a lot of this, because therapy is encouraging people to be self-indulgent, to look back and to justify, use my past to justify either why I'm not happy today, or why I don't treat my wife as well as I would like to, or why I don't have enough patience with my kids. And the reality is that all that stuff's made up. Do you know what I mean, Rocky?
Yes, I do. I do.
Nothing means anything other than the meaning we give it.
Correct. And so I was going to ask you another question. Before we do that, can we drop a link in for people if they want to try out your beta course?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So if people go to liveconscious.com, and it's liveconscious.com, like think different. If people go there and they scroll down, they'll see the 21-day course is available. And I do have a waiting list because people are pretty excited about it, but I'm going to keep doing them. I'm learning a lot. I'm developing this as a practice.
Cool. So you have a Viktor Frankl quote that you like to talk about between the stimulus and response. So I'll let you give the quote and your thought, and I'd like to dig into that.
This is going to be fun because my opinion about this has changed, but let's start with the quote. So the quote is, between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. And in that space is our power and our freedom. And so if people are listening, hold up your hands, your left hand and your right hand, and have your left hand be the stimulus. It's an event. It's something that happens in the world. And your right hand is the response. And as you put your hands closer together, there's less time between the stimulus and the response. In other words, less time to think, less time to be intentional. As you move your hands apart, there's more time to think, how do I want to respond? What would be an appropriate response? What would be a helpful response? So my work for many years has been helping people create more space between the stimulus and the response. There's a variety of ways I do that. The primary one is teaching people a different way to use language, because language influences the way I interpret everything. And there's a way to use language that helps me realize that I have choice. So that's been my work for a long time. It's changed recently, and I'll tell you how, but first I want to check in with you, Rocky, and see if you had a question about the quote.
So, being a parent, probably like most parents out there, the space between the stimulus of the kid and the response is usually about -3 seconds. Because even before they're done talking, it's like you're already responding. And I think even in other parts of life, that same thing happens.
Right.
As I hear you talk about it, I realize, especially when I'm blindsided by something, that that's what occurs. And I'm like, I've got to fix that space. I've got to make sure that when I'm caught off guard or I'm somewhere else and all of a sudden something kind of jars me in that thing, I need to open up that space. And a lot of times, even when we face a problem, more often than not, if we just kind of sit back for a moment, the problem solves itself. And because I think we put more into it than it needs to be. But I'd love to hear what you've kind of learned going forward now.
We can fix this right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are two things. The first one I want to suggest, and your kids is a great example, because 15 years ago, you were 100% responsible for their well-being. And hopefully 15 years from today, you actually won't take responsibility for their well-being unless there's some peculiar circumstance. But as they grow up, part of your job is to transfer responsibility from you back to them. And so when they come home and they tell you something and you have that instant response, it is largely because you still take a lot of responsibility for them. And in my opinion, at their ages of 15 and 17, if you continue to do that, you actually hamper their development, and it's actually disrespectful. I know it comes from love. I know it comes because you care. But that reaction isn't really honoring them as people who are more and more, every day, more and more responsible for their own lives and their own emotional well-being. And so I think the opportunity for you is huge to think of those moments as an opportunity to let them show you who they are.
And I think, honestly, these things aren't when we sit down and my attention's devoted and they have a conversation about an issue. Like as I talk to my daughter about college and my son about school, I let them take onus of it. It's kind of in those flash moments where you're doing one thing and somebody demands an answer, and instead of just stopping, it's like you immediately try to fix it. And I know I need to, in that moment of the emergency, stop.
And this is where the second part of my suggestion comes in. I kind of love this conversation because it feels so natural. The second part is that I'm no longer focused on the space between the stimulus and the response. I think it actually is a very tedious way to work with ourselves or with other people. What I'm focused on is the state of consciousness I'm in before the stimulus ever arises. So if I'm in a state of consciousness of busyness, overwhelm, anxiety, and a stimulus arises, which is somebody wants something from me, or somebody calls, or my daughter tells me something, my response has been predetermined. I'm going to be short, I'm going to be impatient, I'm going to be irritated because of the state that I was in when the stimulus arose. If my state of consciousness is what I call open-hearted, receptive, relaxed, faithful, honestly, it almost doesn't matter what the stimulus is. Short of somebody smacking me or short of a tiger chasing me, I'm going to respond in a generous, loving, thoughtful, patient manner. And so I think the opportunity for you and for me and for everyone listening, the opportunity is to focus on our state of consciousness. And that is the point of great leverage.
And I agree with you, because I know that when I'm in that state, this doesn't happen. And it's when I'm not in that state that this occurs.
And why don't you live predominantly in that state? Maybe you do.
I think for the most part I do, and I think where a lot of this, so I'm very involved in my kids' lives. I coach a lot of their events. So I coach soccer, I coach robotics. When you're with kids for 12 hours and it's like constant of this and that, you end up in that state. And I'm learning now to let go of that more and more. So I think a lot of it was because when we first started doing this, I had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea what they were doing. We were kind of figuring all this out in a pretty high pressure type of thing, because you've only got so much time when you're at tournaments and matches and all those types of things to make reactions, right, fix things. But now that we've kind of learned, we're getting much more. And now when I go there, I'm in the right state. And now I'm also realizing, as I'm growing as a person, that to be aware of what state I'm in, and that I can control my state, and that you have, yes, just in that same instant, you can flip from one state to another, but we do have control of that state. And I think I'm learning to control it.
I'm going to suggest to you the key to being in that healthier state, if you wanted to focus on one thing, it's gratitude.
It is. Be grateful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the one line that I've heard is, it came from Tony Robbins, is when you change your expectations for gratitude, then everything becomes wonderful.
Yeah.
And so
there is a pragmatic part to this that I like to emphasize. So let's just take your situation where you're coaching and you're involved, very involved with the kids. We all need to determine what are the appropriate boundaries for us. So, for example, and I'm not saying this is true, I'm just using it as an example. If you were to be overly involved with the kids, like let's just say you're coaching 5 days a week. I'm making this up. Let's say you're coaching 5 days a week. It may be too much for you. And so each one of us needs to figure out what are the boundaries that allow me to stay in what I call a state of consciousness that's healthy. And I'm not suggesting that we can do it under any circumstance. I'm suggesting we need to create circumstances that allow us to stay in that healthy and resourceful state of mind.
And I agree with that. It's a process. We need to work on ourselves. And to constantly, and I think it came back to your Velveteen Rabbit story, to little by little sharpen off those edges and make them softer and loosen things up a little bit and be comfortable in our own skin.
Yeah, fundamental agreement with you, Rocky. I think that the hesitation you hear in my voice is that some of this, I think, can change very, very quickly if we learn how to access a state of consciousness, which is the same as a state of mind. If we learn how to access that and we have some kind of practice that helps us get into a healthy state of mind, I think a lot of these things we don't need to chip away at for a long time. We don't need to make little incremental progress. We can take a big step if we learn how to get into a healthy state of mind, or what I call an appropriate state of consciousness.
So what would be the first step in doing something like that?
The very first one is what you said. It's awareness. It's recognizing that there are different states of consciousness. And what I've done is I've created a very simple model, because consciousness is potentially a complicated subject. But I've reduced it. I said there's safety consciousness, which is the state of mind I'm in when I have to be highly productive or task-oriented, or I'm driven by time, or I have to protect myself. And then there's heart consciousness, which is this open-hearted, undefended, graceful way of being in the world. And I think we can live there most of the time. And then there's something called spacious consciousness, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but that's a contemplative state where we sort of feel a vast sense of expansiveness and a connection with things greater than ourselves. But the first thing is to recognize, what state am I in and what state do I want to be in? So it begins with awareness. And then the second part, I think, I'm a big believer, and I didn't used to be, I'm a big believer in meditation. I think that a meditation practice, and I'm talking 10 minutes a day, I'm not talking a huge commitment. I think a meditation practice allows me to create new neural pathways that give me an experience of what it's like to be in this healthy state of consciousness. And as I spend more and more time there, it's easier to get myself there. And even when things are around me are stirred up, I have a greater ability to go to this place that's calm, where I feel centered and am non-reactive. So I'm a big believer in meditation. There are many different kinds of meditation. I believe in a particular form, but I think it's a matter of whatever works for someone.
And I think that right there is a big key. Is I think a lot of people are looking for what's the best, and it's not necessarily that there is a best. It's what works for you. Whatever works for you is what's best, not what works for someone else. And we need to be open to that.
And I'll add one thing to that too, is when we find what works, just stick with it. I have so many people that I work with who jump from one thing to another. They're always looking for something better. But when you find something that works, don't be fickle. Just stick with that. Let that be a habit that serves you well.
It's a shiny object syndrome. We're always looking at the shiny object and chasing it instead of being happy with where we are.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I've heard you talk about that I really seem to enjoy, and I think it's a practice that I'm going to start working on, because I think it'll help me with what we just talked about, so that when I slip up, I can fix it. And that's called a redo.
Yeah.
Would you share what that is?
Yeah, this is, to me, it's probably one of the most elegant, simple things that we teach, which is that we teach people all sorts of skills to communicate more effectively and be mature and express your emotions in healthy ways. But we're human. We're always going to make some mistakes. And so the redo is whenever I behave or conduct myself in a way that I don't feel really good about, as soon as possible, I want to redo myself. And what that means is I literally go back, typically to the person with whom I behaved in a way I don't feel good about, and I say, hey, Rocky, you remember how I was just talking to you? I feel like I was kind of impatient, and I'd like to redo myself. I would literally like to say what I said, but I want to say it in a different way. And then I do. I repeat whatever it is that I said before, but this time I say it in the way that I want to say it. I don't spend a lot of time apologizing for the way I said it before. I don't spend a lot of time explaining. I just tell you I want to redo myself. And what I find remarkable is how receptive people are. They just seem to love it. It's like they know that it didn't feel good. Whatever happened didn't feel good to them either. And they really appreciate that I take responsibility to come back and say I want to redo myself. So this to me has been incredibly helpful in avoiding emotional suffering. Because years ago, I would treat Hannah in a way where I was impatient with her. And then I would start being self-critical. And then I would let it build up in my head. And it would go on all day, maybe another day. Meanwhile, we weren't really connected. And I'm just suffering. And probably she's suffering too. Where now, if I'm impatient with her, typically within 5 minutes, if not within a minute, I go back and I say, hey, babe, I want to redo that. I don't feel good about the way I spoke to you. And then I re-say myself, and we hug, and we're all good.
That's cool. I really enjoyed that particular nugget from listening to some of your work.
I also encourage you to teach it to your kids, because these are the things, if I had learned these things, imagine if we learned this stuff, Rocky, when we're 15 or 17, right?
And so it's funny because I was actually seeing something for, it's kind of a new type of college, although it's not really college. But literally what they talked about is, imagine if instead of learning what we learn now in school, that we learned things like this. We learned how to figure out what it is that we were good at and what we enjoyed. If we learned how to love, if we learned how to redo, if we learned how to meditate, if we learned how to be in a state of gratitude, if we learned all these lessons that seem to come later in life, earlier in life, how much better of a life could we have?
Huge, huge difference. Who's doing this?
This actually came out of, this was, I think, something from Vishen Lakhani. He does, Mind Valley is the company.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Mind Valley, but are you saying that there actually are programs like this that are alternatives to college?
I don't know that this is strictly an alternative to college, but what he talked about was that they were going to have a month of learning every year. And every year you would come for a month of learning on these different topics.
That's great.
They just announced it. I think next year was in Estonia. I don't remember exactly where. But as you look at that and you think about that, American culture would never allow that. Whereas European culture, you've got a month off in the summer.
Right.
Go learn and recharge yourself. Whereas most people, I think, have 2 weeks of vacation.
2 weeks.
Which is a shame. I could never live like that.
We do a 7-day program, and it used to be 9, and we've cut it back to 7. But we always say to people, in those 7 days, you'll benefit more than if you did a year of therapy because of the immersion and the focus. And so I can imagine what it would be like to go and do something like what you're describing for a month. I think it would be profound.
And that's true. So if you think about that, if you wanted to learn something and you spent an hour a week on it, in 52 weeks a year, you'd have 52 hours of learning on it. Right. But if instead of spending an entire year doing it an hour a week, if you spent an entire week, 6 days, just cranking it out, all of a sudden you've taken a year of time,
right,
and you've done it in a week.
Right.
And if you can do that with a handful of things, I think that really changes the game dramatically. And these are the kind of things that, had I known this when my kids were 7 and 8, we'd probably do a lot more changes in the way that we raised them and schooled them and the way we did things. But it's not too late.
It's not too late, and be talking about what you would have done differently with them is a interesting alternative way for them to learn some of the lessons still.
And we're having those conversations, like that's literally the conversations we had this weekend around college. And even my daughter was in the same place of, had I known then what I know now, I would have done things differently these last 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I can't look in the rearview mirror, and it would be wonderful to know these things going backward, but I'm thrilled I know them now, and now I can make change going forward.
And there you go again, using that thrilled word.
Absolutely. And that was intentional.
I appreciate it.
And that's the thing. I think if people live life with intentionality, and failure is nothing more than learning. And so in certain senses, I have failed in certain things. That's cool. I've learned, and now we're making changes and getting better. And the whole purpose of this show is to show people all my past failures, especially with money, and then other people's failures, so that you can learn from our lessons and you can jumpstart yourself ahead and not have to make the mistakes someone else did.
Is that why you created the show?
That was a big part of it. It was more so really around the money side of it, because I've made a ton of money mistakes over the years. And in spite of all my money mistakes, I've had financial success. Mm-hmm. The other reason I created it is because everyone was just focused on one little sliver of everything. Nobody is focused on the holistic life. Nobody's focused on saying, where is the balance between work and health and your time and your family? And what about building relationships? And what about constantly learning more? If you don't bring all of these different parts together and figure out how they balance for you, and they're never going to be perfectly balanced. You know, we go through sprints in life, but nobody's really, like, the voice of that is not mainstream.
No, it's not. And I agree with you that it's central. I think, you know, you and I talked earlier, why aren't people happier? And I think a lot of it is we're just out of balance. And so I appreciate the way you've set your show up. I know you have these sort of 8 different areas that you touch on. And to me, it's a really robust presentation about what it means to be human.
Yes, it is. And what it means to live life and to do it intentionally, which I think is a similar word to consciously.
Yes, and the reason I broke consciousness down into those categories of safety and hard and spacious is because it allows me to quickly and easily identify where am I, right? So which state of consciousness am I in during this interview? What state do I invite you to be in? We almost always invite people to be in the state that we're in.
So when we honk our horn and scream at the guy in traffic, we're making sure that he's going to have a great day, right?
Right. We're saying, come on back to safety consciousness.
Cool. So is there anything else that we should touch on that we have not already covered yet today?
I am not aware of anything particular that I feel like we missed. I mean, there's a lot more that we can talk about, but I feel like it's been a fairly full and organic conversation. I feel good about it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I usually ask for an action step. We talked a little bit earlier about one. Is there anything you want to add to the action step or a different action step that you might want to suggest to people?
Well, I'll share a related action step to the question, because the question is, are you thrilled to be alive? The action step, and this is in the graduate part of the 21-day program I teach, at the end of it, you start writing to your buddy every day, and you're writing an email, which is what I loved most today. So I would say, even though your audience hasn't gone through the program, they don't understand it completely, if they want to do something powerful, find a person you care about and make an agreement that you're going to exchange emails every day. And all you're going to put in that email is what I loved most today. Now, this does remarkable things. The main one is that it primes your brain every morning to get up and look for what it is you love. Then, when you share that with another person, you reinforce it in your own mind, as well as sharing it with another person who probably will benefit when they read it. So it's an act of generosity when you share this with someone else. We find this to be, my wife's been doing it since January 1, 2018. And she thinks of all the things we've done, and we've done a lot of things in the last 25 years. She thinks it's the single most powerful thing she's done to help herself.
That's amazing. And I think it's because you put yourself in, you find what you look for. And so if you're looking for thrill and love, you'll find thrill and love.
Mm-hmm.
and that's just the reality of it. So that's a very cool action step. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So if people want to find you, connect, take this course, where do we get all of this information?
The best thing is to go to the website, which is liveconscious.com. It's not live consciously, it's liveconscious.com. Go there. If you want to write to me, I'll always write back. It's jake@liveconscious.com. And if you want to get a good sense of the work we do, I have a book on Amazon. The title of the book is Get Weird, Make the Most of Your Life. And it gives a pretty good foundation for the work that we're teaching in our retreats and our seminars. It's a little different than the 21-day program that Rocky and I have been talking about, but it's got some valuable tools in it.
Thank you for sharing, and I will put all of that in the show notes. And I very much enjoyed today's conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rocky.
Clearly, where you focus your attention is where you get results. You only have one life. Be intentional in creating a thrilling life. Today's action step. Post on the Facebook page what you were thrilled about for the next 21 days. You can see my post every day at facebook.com/Richer Soul. I'd love to have you post your replies there. Together, we can create gratitude and a thrilling life. You're not sure what to post? Ask yourself the question, what did I love most about today? When you see mine, you'll notice that they are small things. Many of the things that we just take for granted in everyday life, but are actually amazing. After this episode, I spent some time on another call with Jake to work on improving myself. He helped me understand some of the underlying language I was using and how I can continue to sharpen myself. I encourage you to reach out to others to help yourself improve. Is there someone you know who could be living a thrilling life? Please share the episode with them, and they'll appreciate you for doing so. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help you build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Can I help you achieve your goals? Just email me and we can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit. You can always reach me at rocky@richersoul.com. I'd love to hear how you're doing and how the information I've shared has helped you. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.